SaaS Therapy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of SaaS Therapy, the show where we help you save your most important business relationships, your customers. My name is Todd Kirk. I'm joined by my co-host, Casey Trujillo, and today we have a phenomenal guest, Debra Wilson, who is a great friend of Casey and I's. I think each of us have now known Debra for well over a decade. Debra works at, I know, crazy, right, Casey?
That's crazy.
It
I
is
know.
wild.
Debra is the head of BrainStorm's marketing team, but she's been here for well over a decade, as Casey and I both have as well. And during that time, Debra led our professional services team, and she also led our learning experience team. So she's had both sides of being on the product and supporting customers and fulfillment and training, as well as now leading up marketing efforts. So we're super excited to have her on the program. Debra, welcome to SaaS Therapy.
Thank you. I'm excited to be in the hot seat. I've been listening for a while and now I get to be in the mix. So thanks for having me.
So Debra, we always start the podcast with a little this or that so our audience gets to know you. Because we know you, we have even specialized questions to ask you. So this is going to be fun.
All right.
Here we go. So Debra, question number one, would you rather have $100,000 or know that your kids would take naps and go to sleep anytime you ask them? So as immediately you ask them to go to sleep, they would immediately obey, and it would happen every time exactly the way that you wanted it to.
You are taunting me at this point. No, definitely number two. I think that I could make $100,000 more if my kids were sleeping. So I think I would get both out of it if we could pull that off.
I love that. Would you rather take a friend on your family vacation or you join their family vacation?
I would definitely join their family vacation. Not because I don't have an awesome family, but I would rather not play host. Like, as much as I can avoid playing host on vacation, like I can just enjoy it. That I'm going to go for that.
All right. I know that you do love to vacation when the opportunity arises. You can only take one SaaS Therapy podcast host with you. Are you taking Todd or are you taking Casey on this trip?
I'm taking Kenzie.
Yeah.
He's the voice of SaaS Therapy, if nobody knows. So when you hear the little, welcome to SaaS Therapy.
The intro at the start.
That's Kenzie. Yeah.
Todd, that
was a great loophole. It was a great loophole.
Well, that's, I think, a great lead into what we want to discuss today is the way that Debra thinks about difficult situations, complex situations, a situation that sometimes our customers put us in, and what is the right approach to take. So I think that was, I couldn't ask the last better question, and Debra couldn't have gave a better answer in how to approach
She demonstrated through her experience that she is perfect for this conversation today.
Great setup. Yeah.
Well done, Debra. Debra, I think it'd be helpful, part of the hope for today's conversation is to talk it through how do we handle difficult conversations, and especially when there's been a breach of trust. And maybe for the benefit of the audience, I mentioned the fact that you started working in the professional services world and then moved over to digital scale training and then onto marketing. Help us understand maybe why. I think people need to understand your background as to why you're perfect for this conversation.
Sure. So you're right. I think that the kind of framework for this topic of, how to recover from a breach of trust with a customer started back when I was managing professional services. We were running, about on average 200 days of instructor-led training per month. And that included, on site, flying around the country, sometimes around the globe, to deliver on-site instructor-led training around various software applications and online. So, you can imagine that between those two, all of the variables involved in delivering that volume of professional services, there was always something going sideways, right? And so we had to develop a system pretty quickly to really first, mitigate for as many errors as we could, but then also to really respond when inevitably those things did go sideways, right? And so, of course, that those learnings were really valuable as I've transitioned in my career to learning experience management, a little bit less intense in the sense that you don't have a customer on the line that you're trying to work with, but online events that you're hosting can still go sideways, and that was a part of that role. And similarly, where you do have more time to react, there are a lot of people who are invested in what you're doing when you're developing thousands of assets for a platform, and you have a lot of stakeholders that you need to make sure you're accounting for, listening to, and responding to. So really, I think that's probably the crux of it, and it's continuing to grow in other, as I'm in marketing now, it's been fun to be able to parlay that into other areas.
Todd, I think you sometimes go to lunch with that person that always one ups you. Like you're like, oh, I recently, ran 48 miles in 48 hours. And they're like, oh, let me tell you the time when I ran 200 miles. And, you're like, oh, okay, thanks for taking my thunder. Right.
Casey,
I think
stop doing that
sometimes,
thing where you talk in the mirror to yourself.
I think
Casey's
some
Casey's
people,
constantly one-upping himself when it comes to running, at least.
I think sometimes people are listening to Deborah and say, "Oh yeah, I ran events and I run 200 days in a month." Like that sounds similar to me. I don't think people understand the complexity of what Deborah is describing. I want to just give a little bit more background. There
Sure.
was a SaaS vendor that was paying us to go do these training sessions. So the SaaS vendor came up with a brilliant idea. I still think it's brilliant today. Is usually when a SaaS vendor does their own training, the customer already has their walls up and thinks you're just trying to sell me something else.
Hmm.
So the SaaS vendor heard the feedback and they contracted with BrainStorm to actually be a third party to say, let's walk through the day of the life of how you could use this software. So what does that introduce? You have the SaaS vendor who has their account executives attending these sessions and wanting our trainers to talk about this and give a sales pitch. The customer, the SaaS vendor's customer is there because they're the ones getting trained and they just want to know, hey, how does this product actually work? I just want the honest feedback. So not only are you trying to appease the SaaS vendor, you're trying to appease the customer, and you're kind of that SaaS therapy. You're in the middle. And so
Yep.
I guarantee you, no one listening today has managed headaches like Debra Wilson has managed those headaches. So I wanted to also give that context.
Yeah,
It's
no,
true.
that's great. That's good context. And I'll just add to that. You're right. Oftentimes, all four parties that were walking into the room had a different objective, right? The solution provider in that setting is wanting to highlight specific features, specific capabilities, specific benefits. The counterpart on the customer side is like, my users need to know X, Y, and Z. And then you've got the end users who are like, no, we need to know A, B, and C, right? And so you've got these kind of three competing parties who all need to walk out of that room satisfied with the experience. And finding that middle ground when you can do that and do it successfully, you've struggled.
So, Deborah, I'm gonna give you a completely fictional scenario, okay? And I'd be curious how you'd handle this. So let's imagine you have a scenario where a customer has been introduced through a SaaS vendor to receive some really in-depth technical like on-site advisory guidance, technical training. And what happens is you set the expectations with the customer to say, okay, well, that means that we need to keep that audience really small, maybe 5 to 8 people. Don't have a giant group in there because it's gonna be too hard to actually manage the expectations. So that's the first part. Then you send that person out on site, and it turns out that they get sent to the complete wrong city, and then you have to fly them without the person going on site being able to get any sleep the night before, show up on site with a customer, and then there's 40 people in the room instead of 8. And then the customer is now mad because A, there was a logistical snafu, and so the training started late, and 2, the trainer who got there is super burnt out and tired because of that logistical snafu. And 3, the customer didn't actually manage any of the expectations properly. What would you do in that type of a situation? My guess is the customer is going to feel super upset, like everything went wrong, and they're probably going to immediately want to blame you and have all kinds of different things that go wrong. And I've never seen anything like that ever happen in my time here, of seeing anything in professional services like that occur. But yeah, so in that kind of fictional scenario, that probably has never happened. How would you respond in that type of a scenario?
Yeah. Well, life is sometimes stranger than fiction. And unfortunately, some things like that, very similar things to that have happened. I would say, in my mind, the foundational kind of mindset that you have to have when you're going, if you're charged with trying to not only logistically resolve the situation, but also make sure that the key parties, in this case, the customer, maybe also the people in the room and whoever's paying for the training are happy. I think the number one thing you need to do is sort of accept that it doesn't matter why things happened.
Mm,
What happened, and it wasn't good, right? So
mm,
you have to kind of you have to have zero ego. You have to go, this, I don't like that this is a representation of me or the brand that I work for, but it happened, and maybe I couldn't control that the flight went, there was an issue with the flight, or I couldn't control A, B, or C. It doesn't matter that you couldn't control it. That's what the customer is experiencing, and they don't care that you couldn't control it, right?
mm.
And so I think the first step is overcoming a little bit of an internal struggle first, to say, okay, I know that the reason this happened was out of my control, but I have to act like they were fully in my control right now, because that's the only way I'm going to resolve the issue, right?
Mercy,
So
that was solid, Deborah. I mean, just step one is so good. I've always believed in the concept that willpower is a resource that can be exhausted, right? If you try to build your life off of just willpower, you're going to give in, and I think everybody's blowing their diet, and they understand that part. I love how you're saying that it happened. Like, we only have so much emotion that we can give in a day. So if I
mhm.
give all my emotion to what happened, I can't fix what I need to change. So just no ego,
Mhm.
just recognize that it happened, and don't waste your energy in emotion that's not going to assist you moving forward. That's brilliant in
Right.
step one.
Yeah, I think you're right. Totally. You have emotional budget, and you have to use it wisely, right? Because if you use it in the wrong place, you're not going to have it where you need it later when it comes down to really solving the issue. So I love that. I would say the next thing I would do is try to really, really put myself in the shoes of every person that's in the situation. So empathy, of course, but really taking that to the next level, not just, oh, what a bummer for the customer, the person that organized this, that this happened. How is it really affecting them? It's stressful, one, but maybe also they put their neck on the line to try to secure
Mm,
funding to get this training done. Maybe they had to assure a few people that this was the right company to work with. Maybe they have their boss in the room, right? And his schedule or her schedule had to be reorganized in order for them to attend, right? So getting really kind of close to the situation, such that you can understand not just a bucket of pain, but a really detailed level of pain. What is the pain that each person is feeling, um, gives you a lot more ability to actually then build the solution. So I think really getting into the detail there is really important.
So, Deborah, I think I would guess a lot of people who have any sort of customer facing role have a really hard time separating the, I guess, the emotional fear of your own kind of personal stake in the game, and focusing on everyone else and the things that they
Mhm.
need. And so I think you really are one of the best at this, at being able to set aside your own kind of selfish desires in order to achieve the outcome that needs to
Mhm.
happen. And so I don't know what this is,
Yeah.
maybe a hard question to answer, but like, how do you do that? Because I think a lot
Yeah.
of people would say, in theory, it makes sense to say it
right.
doesn't matter about being right. It just matters
Mhm.
about, like, not screwing up the end result that we need to have. And sometimes our desire to be right can get in the way of that, or
Yep.
not taking the blame gets in the way of that. So how do you do that? Like,
Hmm.
that really is like, you are the OG SaaS therapist in that regard of like, you got to be able to set aside your own personal desires and focus on just the outcome of the customer. So what's the
Yeah.
key there?
Yeah. So two things. I would say first, uh, it's I have to know that somebody has my back. So
Mm.
I think it is very unrealistic for anybody in a management position who, so for just to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, um, as I was leading the professional services team, there were, of course, several coordinators on the team who were managing the specific engagements. And they often were the ones who were on the front lines having to wade their way through some of these really complex and, challenging customer issues. And when I had previously been in a role like that, I I only could be as effective at solving the issue as I felt safe and felt empowered to solve it, right? So if I felt like I couldn't make a mistake in my attempt to solve it, I think then I would look inward and say, this is about me. If I can't solve this problem, my job's on the line, or my reputation, or um, my brand, my personal brand is on the line. Where if I had a manager or a leader who was saying, I trust you, and if you make a mistake, we go down together, and and we'll do better next time. I didn't feel so panicked. I didn't feel so anxious about how I handled it, because it became much more about what's really the solution than about how is this going to hurt me, right? And so I think as leaders, we have to empower the people uh, who are on the front lines trying to really solve these issues to feel safe. We have to give them we have to show them our trust. We have to back them up when things go sideways, and then we have to teach them later and get better over time, right? And so that's number one. I can't do that. I couldn't do that unless I knew people had my back, right? um, Number two, I would say, is just try to be logical as much as you can. I mean, you can get even into like taking a minute to ground yourself, right? Like a little bit of breathing, a little bit of, whatever meditative tools, you like to use, but a little bit of grounding, so that your body's not in control of you, but you're in control of it. Your mind is running the show. And then being as laser focused on the logic as possible, right? So
Yeah.
what's really happening? Who's in the room? What is the quickest way to solve this issue? Who do I need to communicate with? Who needs to know what? And how can I start to develop, the right answer, the right solution? So I would say those are for me the two keys.
Deborah, I've watched you do that. I've watched people be very, because it's natural for us to be to think, how does this impact me? It's just natural to think that
Right.
way.
Yes.
And so when I'm complaining and I'm all fired up, when someone on the other end is emotionally stable, asks me questions like, okay, who's in the room right now? How do we immediately address this? Now you're turning on a different side of me. You're getting me away from emotion and getting me to think logically. So I remember you always would say, like, hear the person, understand what's going on, because sometimes they just might vent and it might be over with. They just needed to vent. But then you would teach your team, how do we ask questions of, how do we now get this fixed right now if we can, and maybe we
Mhm.
can't fix it, and maybe this is going to have to do something different for tomorrow's sessions. What did we learn today that we could then apply tomorrow so we don't do that? I always appreciated the way that you would teach your team to be logical back to someone that was maybe being a little bit justifiable, irrational, but at the
Mhm.
same time, they're just talking through emotion. So
Yeah.
what would be some of the coaching that you would give to your team? Obviously, hey, I have your back, but what are some of the soft skills that you would
Yeah.
give to your people to help them be able to stabilize the situation?
Right. Gosh, so there's a lot to unpack there. I'm trying to think what to hit maybe first, or what would be most valuable to hit. I think when you're on the receiving end of emotional feedback, you're right. It can feel personal quickly, and I think if you can take one step back and try to kind of remove yourself from the situation and see it as as outside of you, you
Mm,
can be a little bit more logical. So if you can, one tool might be, as I listen to this feedback, I'm going to bucket it. And I have three buckets, and I'm going to say, oh, this is this kind, this is, and then I'm going to laser in. I'm going to focus in on the feedback that I know needs to be addressed most, right? So uh, there are, three types of feedback. This is what we would use. There's feedback that's lashing. This is feedback that is emotionally charged. It probably isn't super valid. It may feel personal, it may feel inflammatory, and what you can do with that is basically kindly ignore it. It's probably not something that's going to be really productive to the situation. You can acknowledge it, you can apologize, and then you can set it aside, because probably the person that's giving you who's speaking in that way to you is knows that, or will know it later, right? There's then kind of limited feedback, which is feedback that would be accurate and true if the person giving the feedback knew something, right? So this might be um, uh, feedback that you would agree with, actually, if you didn't know everything that you know. And in that situation, I think you have to make the decision of, is the best call here to apologize or and move on, or is it to try to explain and give them the information that they didn't know to try to broaden their perspective? Sometimes it's worth giving that information. Sometimes it's not. It's always tempting to want to share it, right? Because it validates your side of things. But sometimes it's actually better to just accept it and get to the solution. They don't really need to know or want to know the rest of why. They care about getting there. So you got to kind of read that. And then I would say, the last bucket is productive. So productive feedback. This is somebody who does have the full picture, who can see what went wrong. You agree with the feedback, and the details are accurate. And that's, to me, actually the most painful kind of feedback, because it's typically like, "Yep, we screwed up," or "Yep, we might have been able to control that, and we didn't do it well." And I think in that scenario, being very genuine, being very authentic, apologizing in a really clear way, taking total ownership. It's Casey, you're right. This is not the way we like to do business here. We really messed up here. I'm not proud of the work we've done. We owe you, and let's figure out what we can do to make that better, right? So it's getting to the solution, it's taking ownership, and then it's walking out of that conversation and figuring out, what do we do to make sure that never happens again, because those variables we did have control of, and yet they still went sideways, right? So if you can kind of take one step back, instead of having an emotional reaction to each piece of feedback, you're kind of like, I don't know, you're playing Candy Crush. You're sending the different pieces to the different places, and then I think you can be a little bit more objective in the way that you respond, because you're distanced from it a little bit and you're thinking about it instead of feeling about it, which in those situations is always more productive, I think.
Deborah, I couldn't help but think, as you're sharing that context of from your experience and your perspective around a CSM who might be on a situation with a customer, and let's say like my SaaS application had an outage and it was down for longer than we would normally expect, because our uptime should be great, and instead, an hour happened and then something terrible happened, like a shipment failed to go out, or I missed a deal, or my own customer was mad at me because your solution failed. The thing that I think is interesting is, I think it's easy when you have somebody who's mad at you, especially, and you're a person who has been on the front lines of having to help people who are upset work through those problems. What I think it's helpful, at least for me, to step back and think, well, they're mad because they care. And
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes it wouldn't I don't think I don't want to put words on your mouth, but I would guess that it's probably refreshing in some way to have a customer who's actually invested in what you're trying to do than have someone who just
Oh
doesn't
my
even
gosh,
care enough to do it, right?
100%.
So if you step
Yeah.
back and say they're angry, but they're angry because they care, that
Hmm.
actually means that you have some common ground because you care too. And so now all of a sudden you have something that you can work through together
Yep.
on. And I think that's
So you're
an
hundred.
important point.
You're totally spot on. The worst I would say, I can take lashing. Like I can take, I can take the feedback. The most painful, the most painful kind of feedback is when somebody, or I guess customer experience, customer conversation, is when you can tell somebody is disengaged. They're like, this is not worth my time. This is not worth my energy. This is not worth my fight. You clearly don't have your stuff together. I'm checking out, right? Like this, I can't. This isn't worth it, right? If a customer is mad, obviously we don't want to ever, put them in that situation if we can avoid it. But if their reaction is anger instead of disengagement, it means there's an opportunity. And I actually think that you know some of the strongest customer relationships that we forged, counterintuitively, were those customers that we had to work through some hard things with.
Mm,
We could come out, if we managed the situation well and we did right by our customer, we could come out of the other side of a situation that seemed really dire and actually have a more engaged customer, a more trusting relationship both ways. We're talking about SaaS therapy. It's like how it is in our relationships, right? When you go through something hard with somebody, you learn to understand each other, trust each
Mm.
other, communicate with each other better. And I think that's true in customer relationships as well.
Deborah, we've talked a lot about how do we react when something has not gone well. I
Hmm.
remember when you ran the professional services team, and I want to stick with the example of when we were actually on site, when you would send
Yeah.
facilitators on site. You had a phrase that you as a team had developed, which was entering the room as a 10. I want you to do two things. One, I'd like you to explain what did you mean by entering the room of the 10? Like, how did you set up the room? What did it look like? Explain that to the audience, because I think that's a proactive thing we can do. And that's what I want you to comment after you explain what it would look like, what you would do differently. I want you to explain the benefits of that, because it's like, I remember one year trying to surprise my wife for our anniversary, and she could tell I made all this effort.
Mhm.
But at the end, I screwed up in a crucial part. But she actually had more
I'm going to
mercy on me
choreographer
because I
that.
had put so much effort into what I was trying to accomplish. And I think
Yeah.
there's some proactive things we can do that
Mhm.
also help us when something goes wrong, that it's like, this isn't like them. This is uncommon because I've experienced all of this. And when this happens, I just know that that's not the normal way. So could you explain what that meant, entering the room as a 10, and then explain the benefits of that if you actually come in with that mindset at the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, I can't take credit for that kind of that line, entering the room with a 10. But it is something that I really believed in and agreed with, and tried to grow into our approach as a team. When it comes to it, in any customer facing role, a CSM, a trainer, an account executive, um, their experience with us is right? They have searched for many different providers, and they have narrowed in on us, or they have chosen our service, they've chosen our product, they've chosen us to work with, and we are it for them, right? On our side, sometimes we forget that because we're trying to manage an entire book of business, right? So they're one of many to us, and we are the one to them, right? And so I think it's important to remember that each time we're delivering anything to a customer, be that a QBR, a new product, or instructor-led training, like we've talked about, um, we have to remember that we have to act like it's also the one, right? We have to act like this is the day of training. We have to act like this is the QBR. Customers can tell when we don't treat them that way, and we owe it to them to treat them that way, because that's what we've sold them on, right? So I think the first thing is to remember that, to remember kind of try to avoid treating them like one of many. And then I would say, if you can enter the room with a 10, and we'll talk about what that means, it becomes much easier if something does go sideways to correct that, because you've kind of started with a foundation of trust, right? You've made a good splash to begin with. So uh, what it comes down to in terms of entering a room with a 10 is preparation, right? It's painstaking levels of preparation, and you know, I mean, we're talking a lot about services in particular. So one example I'll give is we had an you talk about OG. We had an OG trainer. Just I mean, this was somebody who received a 5-star review every time he delivered training. One thing he would hone in on these very small details that maybe people couldn't even name or notice specifically, but that would just create this overall experience that really floored people. So he would go the extra mile of for each device in the room, each laptop in the room. He would carefully um, uh, I guess, bundle all of the cords and tuck them away so you could basically see no cord when you walked in the room, right? Which is much different than like cord spaghetti on the table when you walk in, right? So even small things like that, he would bring a whole pack of these little, Velcro uh, ties that he could use to make sure the table was super clean. Those are the things that can go a long way, right? It's showing up early. It's seeking out, your on-site contact and creating a personal relationship with them when you get on site. It's dressing, well. I mean, I think it's everything. You don't want to be making up for a deficit when you are delivering, right? You want to be starting here and growing. You don't want to be trying to make up for lost ground when you're actually in the moment.
So good. So good. It's interesting because I think that actually applies in so many different places. Like as an example, it's if you're a person in product and you're there might be a tiny little feature that goes through that the customer doesn't even know they care about, and then all of a sudden the product team makes that change and it's such a big deal. Or you're in marketing and you change the way you frame the email and your conversation, and that makes such a big difference. And so paying attention to the little things is such a big deal. And I that makes such a big difference if you're willing to invest that extra time in preparation to ensure a really quality experience for the customer. So I love that insight, Deborah. uh, I think Casey went to what are the things you can do to build a deposit in the bank so you don't overdraw when something does go
Mm-hmm.
wrong. But if we were to turn back to that idea of when something does go wrong and there's a breach of trust and the things that we can do to overcome it, what would you say? Like, I guess the hard part is you're in that situation and you want to, even if your first priority is to get the customer to be happy, and maybe that's actually the wrong priority. The how do you determine, like, what concessions should I make? Maybe I should give them something back. Do I refund them? Do I extend their offering?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you determine what was the process that you went through to try to decide, like, what is the step to remediate it and make it right? And how do I make sure that I don't overpromise to do something that actually gets me into more trouble later, and or avoid coming off as like a stink bug who just doesn't want to help anybody. So like those are two extremes, right? So how did you handle that and determine, like, how to get to the best possible remediation essentially?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there too. I would say that, I guess, first of all, again, kind of your philosophy here that's important to build as a company, so that everybody on the front lines who's managing these situations is equipped. But specifically, what I mean is, I think you have to really believe that if you can turn the customer relationship around, it will uh, pay dividend. It will pay dividends, right? So not only is it becomes less about what do we have to spend to fix the issue, and more about what do we have to spend to make this a win for the customer,
Mm.
right? So what do we have to spend so that when this is resolved, be it the best possible resolution or the best we could have done, um, what do we need to spend in order for the customer to walk away and say, wow, those guys went above and beyond. Wow, that team really understood what was happening and really went out of their way to solve the problem. And so I think, solving the issue was one bucket, if that's getting the bug fixed, or getting the right person in the right city, or whatever it is. But I think that is bare minimum. That's just trying to deliver what you said you'd deliver. But I think you have to kind of think now, all right, not only was that an issue, but there was some collateral damage there, right? So even if we solved it, and ultimately there was a lot of undue stress, there we might have put people in situations where they looked bad. We might have cost them money, right? And so we have to now think about, what do we need to do at a kind of a more personal level to make things right. And so this kind of ties back to that idea of deep empathy or detailed empathy. What is it that actually was the most disruptive? Was it that um, the person who was it that somebody looked bad? If they looked bad, maybe the best thing to do actually isn't that expensive. Maybe the best thing to do is to write an email and ask that it be passed along to everybody else in that person's sphere that was affected, taking responsibility and taking accountability, and making it clear that whomever was our champion had nothing to do with the issue, right? If we can get into the weeds enough to understand, instead of just throwing a discount, or here, take an extra day of this, or get this add-on for free in the product, right? I think we probably throw more money at problems than we need to, because what people actually want solved is usually going to be more interpersonal, right? And we can be pretty creative about solving for those things, if we take time to listen and think about it.
It's funny. My dad. I'm gonna wrap my dad out because he doesn't listen to SAS therapy. But it's almost like on cue, he's going to complain about something to try to get a free dessert, and that's just what he does. And it's embarrassing for everyone around, but he just knows if he does it, he's going to get a free dessert, right? And I think what you're saying is, sometimes if we just have these standard approaches to solving an issue, it almost just kind of, people almost expect it. I remember, Deborah, one time you sitting down with an angry customer and saying, okay, I'm hearing you. Wow. Okay. I can totally understand. How do we change this right now? How do we make this the best experience right now? You got them out of an emotional state. You talked about it. They went through it. Well, come to find out, later in the day, they went through everything and they had raving feedback that everything was amazing. So when they came back to the table with you, yes, they were upset that this didn't go right, but the experience, because you acted on it, it was fantastic for the point of contact. So they just wanted to know, how are we going to fix this in the future? But
Mm-hmm.
they were totally okay with what happened after. And so I think sometimes, if we're emotionally charged and we try to throw answers right then and there, that we might, one, apply the wrong answer to the problem, or two, give away too much to fix it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're taking this in layers, and I've also heard you say, hey, I want to go revisit this. I want to see what I'm going to go do my investigation. I will communicate with you tomorrow at this time and let you know what's taking place next. So could you talk a little bit about just giving yourself also time, but staying in communication with the customer, like that balance? Because again, we might tell ourselves a complete story about how to fix something when it maybe actually turned out better than what our point of contact thought it would be once we resolve the issue. So how do you do that? How do you make sure you don't overreact? How do you make sure that you give enough information to your customer where they don't overreact and say you're not being responsive? What are one or two best practices in that?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's always in your best interest to take more ownership and more accountability than is even requisite, right? So if in a situation it's like a whodunit, like this went sideways and we don't know why. We don't know if it was your tech. We don't know if it was our tech. We don't know. I think in those situations, you always assumptively speak as if it was your issue. So, gosh, I don't know exactly what happened here. There's a chance that our system wasn't working properly, and wow, if that's the case, I'm so sorry. I do need to look into this more, right? Let me go find out exactly what happened so I can tell you that you're due that detail. I owe you that information. Let me go investigate. And as soon as I have more answers, I'll communicate. In fact, even if I don't have more answers, I'll give you an update tonight at 5 p.m. Right. So I think it's people walk into a conversation, they want they want it to be made right. They want you to give them something. They want to be right. They want you to say you're wrong. They want you to they that's very oversimplified, but I mean, I'm that way too. We're all that way, right? When we walk into a situation where we feel slighted or like somebody has not stepped up and delivered on what they said, you immediately want to make sure they understand what kind of a letdown that was. You need to know that they feel the pain too, right? So if you can get ahead of that immediately, if you can give dad dessert right away before he even asks for it, right? I think that's such a win. If you can just immediately out the gates, just show them that you've acknowledged and feel the pain. I think that's huge. And then, the other piece there, you ask for tactics. I would say the other piece there would be over communication. So as soon as you know there's an issue, communicate it. You don't wait 2 hours, because the earlier somebody's aware that there might be an issue or is an issue, the more time they have to internally process what's happening and form their own response, right? Um, so early communication of things that haven't gone well, like communicate bad things early, and then I would say tell them what you're going to do, tell them when you've done it, tell them what the next step is. Over communicate far more than you think you need to, because what you think is over communicating may even still feel like under communicating to them. If they're in the hot seat, they want real time updates and they want to be able to show that something's happening, right? So over communicate and then involve them in the process of the resolution. So this I guess goes back a little bit to your last question, Casey, but if you can get on the same side of the table, that alone is a massive win. If you can say you're right, that this is wrong, this was a big mistake, this was an error, um, you know cause right, wrong, whatever. If you can say what should we do, like you've suggested, right? What's the right answer? There's lots of things I can do for you, and that we've done and that, I have available to me. I want to make this right for you, but I want to make sure we're doing the thing that's going to, that you value the most, that's going to help you the most. So help me understand like where you're feeling the most pain, what the biggest disruption is here, and let's work together on what the right answer is, right?
Debra, you're as someone who I've been able to work with for many many years. You are, I mean, it's pretty self evident if anybody's been listening. Debra has gone through this many times, and she is absolutely the person you want in your corner if you need to help a customer who's frustrated. And so, Debra, this is SaaS therapy, and the last question that we always ask every person who comes on is, "This is therapy. So, what homework would you give our audience?" Based off of this conversation, what should we do? Knowing now that these situations are going to arise, what can we do to improve and get better over time?
Yeah. I would say the most meaningful thing you could do that may have the actual impact long term is the next time that you're on the other side of the issue, where you're the disgruntled customer or you're the person that's been wronged or slighted. Take a second and really assess every emotion you're going through and every thought you're having, and so that you can then take that and kind of flip it and apply it when you happen to be the one on the receiving end. Not and that sounds a little bit trite. I don't mean that in the sense of like have empathy, like listen, but I actually mean almost study your own response, right? Kind of look at it scientifically almost, because I think once you kind of scrutinize it at that level, you can start to kind of figure out the trends and maybe some of what your needs are, and you can start to build your own approach. I think these are some key pillars, but I think there's lots of ways to navigate these situations.
It's awesome.
You did not disappoint. Debra, you're amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to all of our listeners who join us each week. We hope that you come back and continue journeying down this road of SaaS therapy with us so that we can help our customers all succeed. Thanks, everyone. And thanks again, Debra.
Thank you
Thanks,
for
Debra.
having me. Thanks all.
SaaS Therapy is brought to you by BrainStorm, the SaaS platform for SaaS adoption. Learn more at brainstorminc.com.